now tuning into BaisWave.
Hello and welcome back to Based on True Events. In this podcast, we dive deeper into topics your history teacher missed out on telling you. From each region, we will provide you with this extra knowledge, aiming to fill the cracks amongst major historical discussion. In today's episode, we're going to be touching on the Cuban interventions in Angola in the mid to late 20th century and exploring inter-regional historical events during an important period in post-colonial Africa as well as Cuba. Currently, Cuba is perhaps better known by its perilous international position and its significant domestic issues. But did you know that Cuba was once strongly dedicated to international liberation movements through its policy of internationalism? Finding its roots in Che Guevara's revolutionary activities in Africa, Cuban intervention in Angola aimed to solidify the position of Angolan communist anti-colonial figures in governments following its independence from Portuguese colonial rule. At the same time, Cuba's military and logistical interventions struck a deep blow into the expansionist ambitions of neighboring states, including its southern neighbor, South Africa. Not only that, but it also played a pivotal role in the downfall of South African apartheid. In fact, Nelson Mandela, recognizing South Africa's quote-unquote great debts to the Cuban people, said that the decisive defeat of the aggressive apartheid forces in Angola destroyed the myth of the invincibility of the white oppressor, serving as an inspiration to the struggling people of South Africa. So how exactly did Cuba help pull off this historic feat? Let's dive right in to find out. First, we need to take a look at some important ideological and historical background in order to have a firm grasp on this intervention. The ideological undertakings of the Cuban state manifesting in its foreign policy were centered around the concept of internationalism. To introduce it briefly, Cuban internationalism was based on the Marxist concept of proletarian internationalism, which espoused the belief that all popular revolutions are part of a single global class struggle. Cuban foreign policy focused on aiding revolutionary struggles and friendly leftist governments abroad. And Fidel Castro, the president of Cuba at the time, rejected claims that Cuban aid to Angola was intended to serve its own interests, claiming that, quote, "By helping the people of Angola, we are fulfilling a fundamental duty of internationalism." Indeed, in the 20th century, Cuba intervened in many anti-colonial and revolutionary struggles, particularly in other African nations. To get a better understanding of Cuba's actions, we will now take a look at Angola's situation before the intervention. Angola existed as a Portuguese colony for roughly 400 years since the mid-15th century, marking it as an exceptionally long-lasting victim of European colonization. But by the 1970s, the corporatist Estado Novo regime in Portugal collapsed, following the Carnation Revolution, ending the 15-year-long Angolan War of Independence and sparking a wave of independence not just in Angola but among all of Portugal's African colonies. There were also various groups involved in this anti-colonial struggle, namely the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, or MPLA, the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, or UNITA, and the National Front for the Liberation of Angola, or FNLA. These will be important names in the rest of this episode. Following the end of the War for Independence, these groups engaged in a fierce power struggle over who would take power following independence from Portugal. This would be the starting point of the nearly 30-year-long Angolan Civil War, described as one of the deadliest and most brutal conflicts in recent history. There were also many foreign actors involved in Angola at this time. Most important to this episode is Cuba, who backed the communist MPLA and actually had extensive contact with this group in the mid-1960s from training missions led by revolutionary Che Guevara. The Soviet Union also backed the MPLA, though more so with material and logistical support rather than boots on the ground. An important point to note at this stage is that, contrary to popular belief, Cuba acted largely on its own accord in Angola, with having little to do with the Soviets. On the other side of the ideological spectrum was the US, who backed Zaire, present-day the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and its president Mobutu, who had strategic interests in its southern neighbor Angola. South Africa also had its proxy in this conflict, backing UNITA as the MPLA's key enemy. What is crucial to understand about South Africa is that its position in southern Africa faced an immense threat, since its ally, the colonial Portuguese government in Angola, no longer existed, but also from the communist MPLA. In fact, the very idea of communist governance in its northern neighbor was a serious ideological challenge to apartheid. This threat was a key driver of South Africa's military ambitions in the time period to come. So much so that in 1975, in October, the South African military invaded Angola. By late 1975, Angola found itself in a perilous position. In the south, the South African military had begun its invasion of Angola via what is now Namibia, which at the time was part of South Africa. At the same time, the prospect of communist rule in Angola frightened the US, who opted to back militarily the leader of Zaire in the north, Mobutu. Because of this, Castro decided to openly intervene in the conflict, sending a total of 35,000 troops from the beginning of the invasion until the end of 1976. This manifested in the launching of Operation Carlota in November of 1975, which was intended mainly to push back the South African invasion. Cuban troops achieved major success in the initial stages of the conflict. With their help, the MPLA managed to successfully defend against an attack by Zairean forces in the province of Cabinda, an Angolan exclave in Zaire. However, the Cubans' first major success came during the Battle of Cuifangondo, a breaking point in both the domestic struggle for power as well as the South African invasion. Up to this point, the FNLA was the most powerful and sophisticated independence group in terms of military strength, simultaneously receiving aid from the US, Zaire, as well as South Africa. Backed heavily by South African and Zairean troops, as well as arms and air support, they aimed to launch an offensive from the north towards Luanda, Angola's capital, in order to capture the city, which was in the hands of the communists. However, during the Battle of Cuifangondo, the FNLA suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Cuba-backed MPLA, who decimated the FNLA and its allied troops through heavy mortar, missile, and artillery fire, delivering a shocking loss to the FNLA's hopes of capturing the capital. It was during this battle that Angola was officially granted independence, making the MPLA's position highly favorable in the struggle for power. In the aftermath of this battle, the tide turned dramatically in favor of the MPLA, so much so that by February of 1976, the FNLA was essentially annihilated, and the MPLA had taken major FNLA strongholds in the north. By March, the South Africans had fully retreated following the defeat, and as well due to heavy international pressure. In its place, South Africa left an MPLA that had eliminated all threats to invasion, pushing South Africa alongside Zaire back, annihilating the FNLA completely, and forcing UNITA to retreat to the far south of Angola.
In the following 15 years or so, until 1987, Cuba became mostly inactive in Angola, focusing on other revolutionary struggles elsewhere in Africa. That said, they maintained their physical presence there. During this time, Angolan foreign policy focused on supporting the communists in Namibia who were vying for independence from South Africa. As a result of this, South Africa engaged in highly controversial incursions into Angola, which were often labeled as massacres. At the same time, the Angolan civil war carried on between MPLA and UNITA, the FNLA having been entirely defeated. There were some negotiations between Cuba and South Africa for the withdrawal of Cuban troops in exchange for the same to be done of South African troops in Namibia, but this ultimately fell apart. By 1987, the MPLA had attempted successfully to take UNITA-controlled areas in southern Angola several times as part of the Civil War. South Africa also engaged in largely unsuccessful invasions into Angola. So, in August of 1987, the MPLA decided to muster up one final attempt, intending to take all of Angola. In this attempt, they were backed by the Cubans that had been there since the end of the first intervention in 1975. By this point, Cuba had committed to go all in on the MPLA's mission. Alongside Cuban backing, the Soviets committed major support as well. In August, MPLA forces decided to move southward from the town of Cuito, Cuanavale to defeat UNITA forces in southern Angola. However, following a swift response from South African forces, the MPLA was pushed back to Cuito, Cuanavale, during which they suffered heavy casualties. Thus, South Africa's objective of defending UNITA from communist attacks was successful. By November, the MPLA had been pushed back to Cuito, Cuanavale, and had heavy losses, meaning that a defense of their position would be highly unfeasible without a military intervention. Thus, the MPLA officially requested an armed intervention from Cuba. The request was fulfilled by Castro. He sent military forces, which by February of 1998 equaled in the excess of 50,000 troops. In the next 4 months, the MPLA engaged in many skirmishes and attacks with the South Africans and UNITA, often suffering heavy losses. By mid-February, the position of MPLA and Cuban forces was in serious dire straits, and so the MPLA launched a near-suicidal counterattack, suffering many casualties, but forcing the South Africans to retreat, marking a major success after nearly 5 months of disastrous results. By March, a series of successful Angolan attacks, along major South African mistakes and military inferiority, led to the South African and UNITA forces being totally exhausted and overrun. Further battles ensued until June, when a major defeat of South African forces in the very south of Angola led to the South African military officially retreating and a full withdrawal of its troops, marking the end of the 6-month-long conflict. In the aftermath of this, a ceasefire was officially signed and the South Africans, Cubans, and Americans engaged in negotiations on the ending of the conflict. After intensive peace talks between Cuba and the South Africans, a peace accord was finally signed in December of 1988, leading to the full withdrawal of all foreign troops in Angola and, crucially, the independence of Namibia from South Africa. Namibia had a similar war of independence, which was heavily intertwined with the Angolan conflict, and the South African defeat led to the Southwest Africa's independence as a new Namibian state. As is surely very clear by now, the two-pronged Cuban intervention in Angola was immensely impactful not just domestically, but also regionally, and played a crucial role in turning the tide against apartheid in South Africa globally. Following the conflict, the communist MPLA gained power, cementing communism in Angolan governments. Cuba pulled out all of its troops and continued material support well into the 2000s, including funding and training in sectors such as education and healthcare. In addition, this military intervention also helped ensure the independence of Namibia from South Africa, dealing a major blow to the apartheid state's control in the region. Alongside this, the withdrawal of the South Africans and the independence of Namibia killed the myth of South African military superiority and, more importantly, inspired a global paradigm shift in the realization of the abhorrentness of the racist apartheid system. Mandela even referenced Cuito Cuanavale as a key step in South Africa's liberation from apartheid. As also seen in Namibia's independence from South Africa, this conflict demonstrated the weakness of the apartheid system and made clear its underlying structural issues on the international stage. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Let us know in the comments what else you would like us to cover. Thanks for listening, and until next time.
You are now tuning into BaisWave.